Turn off your microphone.
I don't hear anything.
We have planned 45 minutes questions with you. Is that okay?
It's okay.
I have one question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, but I don't see you. Who's talking? Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay.
I have one question.
That's okay. Disembodied voices are fine.
Tell me who you are.
Oh, hi. Familiar face.
One question about what I perceive as a tension between the notion of language as an instrument of thought and the use of internal thought as a key aspect of how we use language on the one hand, and the notion of externalization on the other, in the sense that to the extent that I can reflect on my own internal thinking, I can't get away from the feeling that it proceeds sequentially in a way that mimics externalization. Now, you've for many years obviously had the idea that there was a sense in which internal thought could proceed in a non-sequential fashion. So could you say a bit more about that?
Well, what I've argued actually is not exactly that, but rather that this had to do with the question, the dogma, I believe, and that language is an instrument of communication. And just an obvious reason to doubt that is about probably 99% of the use of language is internal. So that's not communication, if the term has any meaning. But there's a second question, that's the one you're raising, and it's very much the point. Introspectively, in part at least, internalization, internal thought, internal dialogue, which of course goes on all the time, you can't spend a moment without it. Superficially, it appears to be the same as external the production, except that it's of course not produced. And in fact, there are studies that show that when people are thinking, they're small movements of the lips and things like that. And although it hasn't been studied, I've asked some people who work on sign about this, and they told me it hasn't been studied. I assume that signers must think in sign, and that if you could figure out the right experiments, you might be able to detect, motions of the fingers or something or other. So there's something like that going on. But the question is how much? Now, internal dialogue has not been studied to my knowledge. It could be, but I don't think it has. So we only have, to my knowledge, at least just pretty superficial introspection. And at least when I try to think about it, and you can, your introspection's obviously as good as mine. It's not quite what it seems to me is happening. It seems to me when a sentence is produced internally, it just comes out instantaneously. There's something going on before it that's just coming out in instantaneous external thought. And often it just comes in fragments, like there's a phrase or a word or something like that. And then if you bother, you can produce internally the full sentence. And I suspect what that means is something that we have evidence for in other domains, that thought is just going on unconsciously, just like planning, and apparently everything else that's happening seems to be unconscious. At some stage, parts of it reach consciousness, parts apparently. And I suspect at least that that's true of internal language as well. Now, I think this could be studied. You can think of ways in which it could be studied. But I think it's quite an interesting question and ought to be studied.
Hello, Professor Chomsky, Jim Herford from Edinburgh. Can I ask you a technical question at a very basic level? So take the operation merge. This is for my information to try to understand your theory. And take a simple example like merging the with dog to produce the dog.
The dog.
The dog, right. Now, the dog has a sensory motor interface, we pronounce it, and has a conceptual intentional interface. We think we understand what we mean by the expression. Now, the two elements that are merged to form that, namely what we call the word the and the word dog, what is there in them beside their conceptual intentional interface representation and their sensory motor representation? Is there any intermediate, for example, syntactic category information that says these things may be merged or not?
Well, any two things can be merged. Merge is just free. If it's very often merge will give deviant expressions. And there's nothing wrong with that. Deviant expressions are used quite naturally in language. For example, metaphors are deviant expressions. And there are many more extreme cases. Almost anything that you merge together anyhow, any way you do it, has some sensory motor and CI interpretation, even word salad. So the question is, what is it that gives a non-deviant interpretation to the dog? Well, first of all, I think they're each probably more complex. Certainly, at least dog is. For example, a dog's kind of a predicate. Something must tell us that it's a predicate. That may have internal syntactic form. If people think it's a noun, it might be the form, say, N, where N is the functional category that distinguishes nouns from verbs and some root. It's one approach. Lorentz,
So in the elements which are to be merged, there is central syntactic information such as the category noun and maybe the category and each of them, and that's what says they may be merged.
Yeah, in fact, a lot more. So if you get to more complex notions like, say, a verb, there's pretty good evidence that it at least consists of what's sometimes called a small verb, something that assigns the category verb, and which in itself has many flavors. It can include transitivity, causativity, and so on, and a root element. One kind of extreme position, which could be correct, is largely Chagit Barer and Alec Morantz, which essentially claims that all languages are like Semitic. They consist of uncategorized roots and other properties. In Semitic it would be vowel pattern, but it could be other morphemes, which assign them a richer category. And it may be much more than that. So it could be that in small verb phrases there's lots of internal functional categories. And then if you move over to the work in categorical grammar, it suggests a pretty rich structure of, not categorical grammar, cartographic grammar. It suggests a pretty rich structure of functional categories with all kinds of properties. So that's all to be explored. But I think, and then there's another question. The approaches called distributed morphology argue that, depending on how extreme the position is, either some or all of the sensory motor properties, phonological properties, are just added in externalization. So these are real issues. I mean, real, correctly contested issues. You have to work them out. They have lots of consequences. But in the simplest case, we might imagine that, the item that's pulled out of the lexicon, the sort of atom of communication, is some conglomerate of semantic, phonological, syntactic properties, which will...
You did just say atom of communication, not atom of thought. Was that a...
Pardon?
You did just
I'm
say...
sorry?
an item pulled out of the lexicon, an atom of communication, I guess.
No, an atom of computation.
Right.
Yeah, I meant an atom of computation. See, I'm trapped in the dogma that I'm trying to reject. You're correct.
Yeah, I noticed.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Liz Phillips.
Hi.
If I could come back to this notion of language as an instrument of thought, it's a notion that I find very appealing and useful in thinking about children's cognitive development. But I do have two naive questions about it. The first is, why do we have an interface to sound at all? I think your intuitions about thinking not requiring reciting a sentence to oneself are probably right. And if they are right, why do we bother with that interface and all of the problems that arise from it? And the second related question is, why are there different languages? It would seem we all have fundamentally the same kind of minds. Why isn't all of language innate such that we can use this computational system in thinking without having to acquire it?
Yeah. Well, let's imagine an evolutionary fairy tale. There's a ton of literature about what's called evolution of language. In my view, it's 99% fairy tales. So I'll add another one. It's about the simplest fairy tale you can imagine, I think. So I assume at least this part must somehow have happened, maybe more complicated things. So let's go back to the picture I mentioned. Say there's some kind of pre-linguistic sensory motor and conceptual apparatus around. There has to be. And then, of course, the sensory motor system was apparently around for hundreds of thousands of years before there's any evidence of modern human cognitive capacity or language. And the conceptual and conceptual systems, whatever it is, maybe predicate argument structures, action, actor-action schemata, some kind of ways of talking about things, but apparently not conforming to the referentialist doctrine and so on, whatever it was. Something had to happen to get language. In fact, several things. One thing that had to happen is there had to be somewhere a recursive device introduced. Simplest possible one would be merge. So let's say that. So say 75,000 years ago, some person had in one small hunter-gatherer troop, which is what the various hominins were at the time. One of them happened to have some rewiring of the brain, maybe a mutation, small mutation, which yielded merge. Okay, that person would have had the capacity for internal thought. It could have produced internally an unbounded hierarchy of expressions internally. And if they're linked to the pre-existing conceptual intentional apparatus, it's got internal thought. Now that's the only person that has any language capacity, so there can't be any interchange among people. If that mutation had any selectional advantage, and it might, a person could think, plan, reflect, and so on, it could be partially transmitted to offspring. And if that had some selectional advantage, then over time, maybe a short period of time, it could spread throughout a small breeding group. Now, it's well known that mutations that have selectional advantage usually just die out. But sometimes they obviously persevere, otherwise we'd all be, bacteria. So sometimes they persevere, and maybe this one did. If that were the case, at some point, a number of people would have this capacity. Well, at that point, somebody might get the bright idea of externalizing it so they can interact with one another. In that case, that's a hard problem, because if this picture is correct, the internal system is kind of like a snowflake. It just develops without any external pressures, right? So therefore, it would be as perfect as possible, strong minimalist thesis. So you've got this kind of snowflake in your head. You have a sensory motor apparatus which has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. You got to match them up somehow. Okay, hard cognitive problem. And in fact, it can be solved in lots of different ways. Every child acquiring language has to solve that problem. There's certainly constraints on it, but we know it can be done in lots of different ways. It's also very mutable. Teenage jargon changes it, Some things, like say the Norman Conquest, change it radically. It's easily mutable from generation to generation. Lots of ways of solving it. It may be solved many times in many different ways throughout the apparently pretty brief course of human history. And as I mentioned, nothing seems to have happened in at least 50,000 years. And you go back not long before that, there's no indication that there was any kind of complex cognitive behavior. So something happened in a pretty narrow window. And it could have been at least this. In fact, my own feeling is that this is about as much as we know about evolution of language. As I say, there's a ton of literature on it. But I don't think it's about evolution of language. If you take a look at the literature, first of all, one reason I don't think it's about evolution of language is that the phrase doesn't mean anything. Languages don't evolve. Languages are not organic objects. They don't have genes. So they don't evolve. Language speakers evolve. But as I said, there's very good reason to believe they haven't evolved in at least 50,000 years, anything more than very marginally. Some marginal evidence that they might have. But so it's basically fixed. And there's a lot of different ways of solving the matching problem. So you get what we call different languages. But if we understood enough, maybe we'll see someday that there really is only one language.
So if I could follow up and see if I understand by turning the argument from evolution to language acquisition. Is the acquisition of language the acquisition of the particular way that the people in this community use the system that we all already have in order to exchange information between each other? Or is there some more fundamental change within the language system itself? How do you think about acquisition in this context?
Well, there's an awful lot we don't know, so anything you say is speculation. But I think the simplest assumption, and the one that, if we think of the trajectory of, say, the last 50 years, both in linguistics and incidentally in biology, I think they're going in the same direction. I think they both lead to the speculation that at the core there may be only one system. So take, say, general biology. You go back 50 years, the analog to the Boasian tradition was very widespread. Organisms can differ in every possible way. Every new one that comes along, you got to study on its own. And by now, things have changed so dramatically that it's possible, it is proposed and not laughed at, that seriously it's proposed that there's just one complex, in the post-Cambrian period, there's only one, organism with a lot of different arrangements of its various components. One kind of universal genome, sometimes called, with minor modifications. Not everyone accepts that, but it's considered not inconceivable. That's Sherman at BU is considered a pretty reasonable possible proposal because things have just changed enormously. With the discovery of deep conservation, homologies, similarities between humans and yeasts, and so on and so forth. And I think in some ways the study of language has been going kind of in the same direction. Well, if that continues, let's say it does, acquisition could turn out to be just solving the problem of how the fixed internal system, which yields all these complex interpretations, happens to be linked to the sensory motor system in this community. It's not a tremendously, a child masters it within a couple of years on the basis of very little evidence. And there are strict fairly strict. By now, it's understood that there are very strict stages that a kid goes through. Also, on the basis of work like, say, Lila Gleitman's and others, it's by now reasonably clear that the child knows a lot more than it's producing, way more. And in fact, there's even some indirect evidence that by around the age of 2, the child may have acquired virtually everything. It's Helen Keller type case. You lose, there's not a huge number of cases studied, but there's some that seem to indicate that if speech and sight are lost, hearing and sight are lost around age 2, the child can acquire virtually perfect English. In Helen Keller's case, 20 months, magnificent English. But there's other cases studied. On the other hand, if it's younger than that, they can't seem to acquire it, which at least suggests that somewhere in that period, the rudiments are there, even though very little is produced, like maybe 2 words or something. So something like that seems to be going on. And it's pretty well established that the language, the externalization that children pick up for curious reasons seems to be that of their peers, not their parents. So like I talk like the kids on my block, not like my parents. And I think that's pretty normal. Why, who knows? But so something is going on that's fixing all of these things. And as I said, if you're learning a second language, those are the things you have to basically memorize. I mean, a lot of it, is undoubtedly coming from fixed principles that are unconscious, but a lot of it just has to be memorized. And it's what language acquisition roughly looks like, I think. And I suspect the same is true of the kinds of things you study with, object permanence and so on and so forth. It's got to all be there somewhere.
Professor Chomsky, if I may just briefly follow up on your fairy tale about evolution of language. So the conceptual intentional system is ancillary, you say, and so is that's at the core. If you don't have that, you have no language. In fact, there are some interesting cases. Unfortunately, the first objects
sorry.
which emerged by the mutants were conceptual intentional representations.
Of some kind, yeah. There's some interesting things to look at. There are some things. I mean, for example, there was a recent study by a couple of Japanese scientists studying zebra finches, I think, who claimed, there's a couple of papers in which they claimed to have found that they were able to have something like a context-free grammar, of course, with other kinds of noises, which would give things of the form ABBA, ABC, CBA, and so on and so forth. Well, I was kind of hoping that would turn out to be true, because if it would be quite interesting. Unfortunately, apparently it's false. The material's been reanalyzed by Bolhoy, Spurwake, and others, and it turns out to be just some kind of association. But if it were true, or if it could be found somewhere, that would kind of it was presented as if it undermines theories of UG. On the other hand, it would support them, because if you think about the fairy tale that I just told, if this was a simple mutation that yielded an unbounded combinatorial system of the simplest kind, question arises, why doesn't it happen all the time? Well, maybe it did happen all the time, even in the line that led to Homo sapiens. Maybe it happened over and over again, but it just never linked up to anything. So it died out. And if the story of the zebra finches had been correct, it might be a case where in a totally independent evolutionary line, just convergent evolution, you found this same minor change taking place, but there's no conceptual intentional system, so it didn't get anywhere. It's possible, It would be nice to find evidence like that, and it's not Yeah, it's not an unimaginable investigation in comparative biology, but it's the kind of thing that I think, in a way, is kind of sort of predicted by this evolutionary fairy tale, which again, in my opinion, is about all you can say about evolution of language. Again, that's a very minority opinion, as you know, but
I would like to come back to the remark you did when you referred to Kennedy. You spoke about cultural gaps, and especially I would like to speak about the gap concerning number. So Ken mentioned that in many languages with what he called poor technology, you have very few numbers. And quoting you, that numbers were everywhere, including the kinship system.
in the
kinship system.
well, Ken argued that, yeah,
Yes.
not quite that. He didn't put it quite that way.
No, he didn't.
What? Yeah.
Yes.
No, what he said was that we have innate mathematical capacities, which is why, say, Walbury, if they enter a market economy, instantaneously they're doing everything, you know, counting, multiplying, whatever it may be. So it's all in there. And what he argued is, it's an interesting suggestion. It's not in that paper, it's in different papers, that also in the 70s, that this internal capacity, whatever it is, can show up in many different forms. Like in modern Western societies, it shows up with people who work on number theory, you know, try to prove Fermat's last theorem and so on. And he said in other societies, it shows up in developing intricate kinship systems. And he pointed out that if you look at kinship systems, he said, contrary to general assumptions, that they really have no, a lot of times they have no functional significance. They're just, you know, he argued they're just the workings out of mathematical capacities. He also pointed out that societies would have experts. So like there's some specialist you go to who can, you know, work out the details of who's a third cousin twice removed or whatever it may be, which is kind of like arithmetic. You know, they're specialists. They teach in the math department. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask you is, could you, in your opinion, tell us what these mathematical properties of these systems are?
Well, the simplest answer is no, but I think you can get at least a start on it. I mean, if you think of, let's say merge came along somehow, okay? However, if you just think about merge, just as we believe it is, and you imagine a lexicon containing one element, and you let merge apply freely to it, you do get a model of the number system. So it could be that there's a model of course it's not the numbers, you know, it's not, we're not talking about, you know, Frege, but what's our internal, so it's not metaphysical, it's epistemological. What's our internal model that allows us to use the number system, the thing that the Walbury have when they enter a market economy? Well, conceivably it's merge restricted to a single element lexicon. And there's several ways in which you could build up a kind of a numeral system out of that. And if you have that, it doesn't take a lot to add addition. And if you have addition, you can add multiplication, then you have arithmetic. And there is a kind of a, you know, a sort of tradition, a standard notion in modern mathematics that, you know, God created the natural numbers and man created everything else. And that's sort of, it could be that we don't need God at this point, that the natural numbers, or at least our conception of them, is just, it comes free if you have language. And the rest of mathematics really is a human invention. So set theory, which is basically the rest of mathematics, has what amount to empirical assumptions. and you can debate what they are. So you have debates between, intuitionists and Zermelo Franco set theoreticians and so on and so forth, but they're not like arithmetic. And that's, more, we have other cognitive capacities, plainly, besides language, so they may be involved in constructing the rest of this intricate system beyond mathematics. Take, say, Bourbaki, really serious mathematicians, the greatest ones. If you look at their first volume in that series, they argue, which is History of Mathematics, they argue that mathematics basically has two intuitions. One is counting, the other's visual perception. So discreteness and continuity. And they argue that all of mathematics is just playing with these intuitions. And they were kind of intuitionists, so but really the major mathematicians of the 20th century, these are not exotic figures. So maybe that's it, yeah.
We have to come up in front to ask questions?
It's okay. We can have the mic.
I don't hear.
But Tom hasn't asked a question today yet, so maybe first Jacobs and then.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Hello, this is Sander from Paris. I wanted to continue on this topic of mathematics, actually, and asking you about the plausibility of this position. The very same tools are being used for language and for mathematics. This is how I understand your position. There is some evidence for dissociation between the two, and it starts with the intuitions of mathematicians like Poincaré, who said that he was not using, or Einstein, who said he was not using language at any point when he was doing mathematics. But also there are more serious cognitive science evidence for dissociation between, for instance, deeply aphasic patients who are still able to do algebra or mathematics, or the cases maybe even more impressive of autistic children who don't develop much of a language.
That's interesting.
But can still do some sophisticated computations. So you want to comment on that and the possibility perhaps that the merge operation is distributed in different systems?
Well, first of all, is Luigi Rizzi there somewhere?
No.
I read somewhere that Luigi was participating. Is he there?
No.
Oh, I'll quote him in that case. This question has come up.
Not arrived yet.
What?
Luigi is going to arrive tomorrow.
Oh, okay, so you can ask him if I got it straight. I actually wrote about this some years ago, and I was curious. First of all, to go back a step, there is a reason to think that not all of mathematics, but at least arithmetic, is just innate. So the Poincaré-Einstein issues, I think, are separate ones. They don't have to do with arithmetic. They both took arithmetic for granted. And it could be, and there is the question that bothered particularly Wallace back in 1880s. How come he just noticed that every human, no matter who they are, seems to have mathematical capacities, essentially what Ken Hale pointed out. Arithmetical, he meant. And how can that be, since plainly they were not selected? In fact, arithmetic is never even overtly used until very recently, and then only marginally. So how come everyone has the capacity, but it plainly wasn't selected? And he went on to suggest, Wallace, that there's got to be some other factor in evolution beyond natural selection, and he and Darwin had a big debate about this. But the observation is it's an interesting puzzle, and it suggests strongly that arithmetic, at least, is some kind of exaptation. And it could be, as I mentioned, that it just comes free from natural language. Then what about that's just arithmetic, remember. It's not set theory, it's not classical analysis, it's not topology, and so on. So what about the dissociations, which have been shown in the psychological literature for, I think since the 1920s? You can fill me out, but they've been around for a long time. Well, I brought that up as a puzzle, and Luigi pointed out something relevant, I think. He pointed out that the psychological experiments are always about performance. That's the kind of experiment we know how to carry out. And it could very well be that the dissociations have to do with performance, but that there's the same system in there somewhere. And if you could figure out the right kinds of experiments, you might find out, say, that these autistic kids you're talking about, who it goes both ways, who have arithmetic but no language, or language with no arithmetic, that actually they both have everything, but that there are differences in how the performance systems work, access to the internal system. I don't think that's unlikely. I mean, so to take an analogy, which actually Luigi brought up, he said there's also dissociations between speaking and reading. Okay, so there are children who have reading disabilities or can't read at all, but whose language is perfect. But that we don't conclude from that there's a reading instinct. It's just that they're the kind of performance that they can carry out using the internal system of knowledge differs for one reason or another. But it's a performance difference. And in fact, until cognitive psychology can figure out ways to study something other than performance, which is not so simple, you'll get superficial results which appear to mean something but really don't, just as the reading-speaking dissociation doesn't tell you that there's a reading instinct. You can ask Luigi when he shows up tomorrow.
Clearly, I know. It's Tecumseh Fitch.
Hi. Hi.
I wanted to come back to the bird example that you brought up, the Bengalese finches, and sort of probe this notion of the simplest possible combinator. So merge, you often talk about merge as being the simplest possible, but it seems clear from the birdsong literature that there's something simpler. Let's give it a different name just to keep it clear, like combinator. And what birds seem to be able to do is combine atoms. So what well, this is a bit of a stretch, but at least hypothetically, they can't combine sets to form higher order hierarchical sets, but they can combine atoms. So if we call this combinator, I don't call it whatever you want, but call it this thing that can combine atoms and specifically not combine sets. If that's what birds have, and that allows them to actually produce permutations, for example, though actually no, permutation would be a set, so this would have to be a series. But so it actually can give you quite a bit, but it won't give you all of the properties that we're interested in merge. Yeah. Then the interesting question to me is, what else do you need? What gets you that extra bit, where instead of just combining atoms into a bunch of atoms, you can combine sets, where you get both internal and external merge and the recursive properties. What computationally, mathematically, do you need to get that extra thing? I mean, we could write it down as a bunch of brackets. We could write big brackets, but what does that really mean?
I think it's just it's a question of whether merge is bounded or unbounded. Like birds, or I suppose any animal, can put two things together. Okay, that's merge. It's just not unbounded merge. The question is, can you, after you've put X and Y together, can you take that thing that you've constructed and merge it with Z and get a new thing and do it indefinitely? For language, you need unbounded merge. And I suspect the cases you're describing are just bounded merge, maybe bounded to the level of 1. It's like a K-limited finite automaton in mathematical terms, and probably K is maybe 1, So that's, a K-limited finite automaton is a case of merge, but just with extreme limitations. It's bounded, and it may have some numerical bound, maybe having to do with the fact, with what's known about arithmetical capacities, that in some cultures, a lot of cultures have maybe 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then just many or something. But I think it's just, I think it's the same. You can't have anything simpler than merge. That's as simple as you can get. It can either be bounded or unbounded. If it's unbounded, you get what you need for language, at least a large part of what you need for language. This is, I think a lot of things are like this. Take this article that came out a couple of months ago, I guess, in Cognition about baboons. You saw the Ray, Parachet, the rest of it. Yeah, you saw that. Okay. Well, it's totally meaningless. I mean, it's what they found is that, after 50,000 trials, they could get these unfortunate animals to handle ABBA, and not ABBC or something. Okay, maybe. But as they point out, it's probably just association. Well, association is just bounded merge, very bounded merge. And then here, I actually had that in mind in some of what I was saying. They cite people in the computational science literature, people who should know better, who don't make the distinction between what amounts to a stored program computer and a list. So they argue that, if people are trying to process self-embedding, they kind of break down around 2 or 3. So therefore, maybe that's just association. No, that's not. Because if you just give them more time and memory, they'll go on forever. It's a stored program computer. Now, that's the point that Randy made in his critique of connectionist neural net systems. You have to distinguish between a stored program computer, Turing machine, something with fixed rules that you never change, and a list of calculations up to a certain point. If you don't make that distinction, everything's nonsense. These are really elementary points, but they're just overwhelmingly missed. It's kind of astonishing, I think.
But so to be clear, what Prometheus got was not merge. It was unbounded merge. And for all we know, all of Prometheus's ancestors had merge, but it was just this sort of same hierarchy as these finches.
I presume, I suppose that, just about any kind of animal we're interested in is going to be able to put 2 things together. Okay. The question is whether once they've got those 2 things together, can they construct a new thing which will have the same properties and be interpreted uniformly. Remember, there has to be a uniform interpretive procedure, fixed interpretive procedure, no matter how many you build up. Well, that's essentially unbounded merge with interface connections. That's the, interfaces plus recursion equals language, question mark, picture,
Nice.
Question mark being whatever else there is. And I think the topic of linguistics in a certain sense is what's the question mark? Because the interfaces plus recursion seems, almost conceptually necessary.
Yes, I know it's Adelaide, and I have a question for you.
I don't see you. Oh, you're hidden. Okay. Yeah.
So I have a question for you on principles of efficient computation and the competence performance distinction. So do you think that these principles apply only on the narrow language faculty? Recently, we have this notion of pronounce the minimum, right? So it's perhaps something that is related to the externalization system, and the possibility that it also applied to local economy, Fox's principle of, QRing only if there's a semantic difference. So my question to you is that whether these principles would limit the complexity, apply only to narrow syntax, or whether they would apply in a general way to the language in a general sense.
Well, again, remember, all of this is pretty wild speculation, but I think a plausible speculation is that computational minimization of computation is just a universal principle. It may even hold for the inorganic world. That the things have to be as simple as possible, basically. I mean, that's the guiding intuition behind all of science, really. And in the organic world, we find, you can suggest that you find it in other places too. Like, say, take Cherniak's work on minimization of neural connections in nematodes and so on, or work on which Chomsky's worked on optimal foraging strategies, things like that. You'd expect to find this all over the place. So you'd expect to find it in externalization. And in externalization, it's pretty straightforward. Articulation is an extremely costly operation. You know, a whole lot of the brain is involved in it. And the less of it you do, the better off you are. Furthermore, that's even apart from the internal computation that goes on before you even get to articulation. You know, like the whole of phonology and morphology, for example, which can be pretty complicated. So you do as little of it as you can. Well, if you do as little of it as you can, what you'll produce is you'll externalize typically just the hierarchically most dominant element, which a copy, which tells you that something happened. Now, there are, as you know, alternative theories that argue that there's another way of doing it in which you externalize only the hierarchically deepest element. That would be a theory of, you know, the covert movement, basically. You know, could approach it that way. There's also interesting cases. By now, a fair amount is known about this, where you have externalization, you have a deletion of copies, but something is left behind. Something's left behind where you delete. And there are a lot of cases of this, of different kinds. So there are things that mark the positions of successive cyclic movement, like Esther Torrego's work on, verb raising, or a work by Sandy Chung and Collins on agreement relations at the intermediate positions, or Doug Satty's discovery that in Indonesian there's a particular morpheme that shows up at the VP level if there's been successive cyclic movement. And there's current work going on by Norvin Richards in my department with Dinka, which has very interesting cases of some kind of apparent mark, an interesting kind, a limited kind, that shows up wherever there's successive cyclic movement. There are other cases where some morpheme is left behind. So, you know, to buy a book is hard, you know, buy or something. So some element is left behind. And that's under very narrow conditions. There's a dissertation at MIT about it a couple of months ago by a Vietnamese student who just got his PhD, trying to identify the specific conditions where that happens. These are quite interesting cases. They all pretty strongly support copy theory. I mean, something's going, and successive cyclic movement theories, but they do indicate that some language might decide to leave a bit of noise around that tells you something's happened under very limited conditions. But I think this probably all reduces to just minimal computation. Danny Fox's cases might somehow fit into that. It's not exactly obvious how. They have to do with, I mean, that's all completely internal, you know, no externalization at all. It has to do with how you interpret quantifier variable constructions in terms of minimal internal computational operations. And as he shows, it shows up in ellipsis and interpretation and various other things, which seems to suggest that in the interaction to the CI system, there's also some kind of optimization going on, which is quite, of course, all of this is totally unconscious and, you know, no direct evidence for it, can't be learned, and so on.
There are 5 minutes remaining, so I'll make this a brief question. I wonder if you have any thoughts on why syntax seems to care more about, if you look at the features that syntax manipulates, it seems to care more about certain types of semantic distinctions than others. And the background of this question is work like Gillian Ramjan's, the Buchanan, that argue that the way you strap arguments onto the verbs sometimes uses these kind of notions of
work that ties the semantics of number ultimately back to features that you use for aspect, the relationship between person to existence, spatial to existence. Looks like measuring out of parts and places and quantities is fundamental, but things like color just don't seem to get a look at. Does that give us some clue as to what syntax might have evolved for as an original system of merging concepts?
Yeah, actually, you're much better placed than I am to answer that question since your work. But yeah, I'm sure it does. There's some, I presume that this is a reflection of the interface condition, which says there's some things that the computational system is attending to at the CI interface. There are others it's not. So it's going to treat number quite differently from color. And that tells you something about human conceptual apparatus, about the and extra-linguistic cognitive system that the combinatorial system of language is linking to. Right? I think this is, in a sense, it belongs in the same domain as why our most elementary referring elements involve certain properties and not others. So why does our notion of person, let's say, pick one that goes back thousands of years in the history of philosophy, our concept of person. In the history of philosophy, it's often discussed as the concept of soul or something like that. But it's quite interesting, and it has very striking properties. So say you read Locke, he was struck by the fact that, just doing thought experiments, that we can easily imagine that one soul, or mind if you like, can be in two different bodies at the same time, and that it's the same person even if the physical body that it's in changes totally. Okay, actually fairy tales are based on this, so children understand it, easily. The standard fairy tale, the wicked witch turns the handsome prince into a frog, and he stays a frog, every property of a frog, until the beautiful princess comes and kisses the frog, and out comes the handsome prince. But the child understands that no matter if that thing has all the properties of a frog, it's the prince. So psychic continuity is a critical element in individuating persons, and also animals, because they're similar stories, easily stories about animals. This is all over science fiction. And it leads to traditional paradoxes. You look back at the history of philosophy, there's a whole history of paradoxes, like where we just don't have answers. The famous one is the ship of Theseus, Plutarch. So there's a ship in the Athens Museum, which is the ship of Theseus. And one of the boards rots. You take it off, put in another board. It's still the ship of Theseus. You continue to do this until every board has been replaced. Still the ship of Theseus. Meanwhile, somebody outside has been collecting all the boards and puts them all together and reconstructs the original, and that's the ship of Theseus. Well, now there's two things that are the ship of Theseus, which can't be. Okay, that's true. It can't be if you accept the referentialist doctrine, which holds that the phrase ship of Theseus picks out an entity a metaphysically individuated entity in the world. So that just tells us, well, that's not the way our referential expressions work. Actually, Kripke's puzzles all depend on this. You can play around with science fiction. Actually, here's an experiment which somebody might try out. I tried it with extremely small a sample, my grandchildren, who dragged me to watch some science fiction movie. It's some science fiction series where people are on a spaceship, and on the spaceship there's some kind of a box that you can go into, and it sends you off to another planet, and then the person emerges on the other planet, and it's the same person. So, I asked them at one point, well, suppose the person stays in the box when he shows up on the other planet. Which one is the person? That's the ship of Theseus. They were completely confused. They had no answer. Okay, that just tells us that our our notions of referring do not meet the referentialist doctrine. They are not relations between a word and a thing. There's a much more complex perspective that we use to look at the world, and sometimes the perspective doesn't give you any answers. So that tells you something about our conceptual system, and I think what you're describing does as well. Why don't we use colors, but we do use number, see? Yeah, it's something about the way our minds work.
We have very strict instruction
Yeah.
for that.
Okay.
And you cannot be at two places at the same time. So, thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot.